What's good? It's Woog. We have a key rematch in the heavyweight division. Zhilei, 25 wins, 1 loss, and 1 draw, is taking on Joyce, 15 wins and 1 loss. That 1 loss, obviously, at the hands of Zhilei, or we'll say Zhilei Zhang. And this rematch comes with a lot of interesting elements. Like, check this out. Going into Joyce versus Zhilei, the first one, Joyce was like a 9-1 favorite, and I saw Zhilei Zhang at like a plus 600 or more underdog, like a 6-1 underdog. And so it's just funny when you hear people going, in the commentary going into this rematch, like, Joyce needs to move his head more. Joyce and his style just don't match up well against Zhang. It's like, where was all of this going into the first fight? I mean, it's not like there are too many things about either one of these fighters that we didn't know going into the first fight. The only person who I really saw plant their flag and to say, I don't know what these odds are talking about, I'm going Zhilei all day, I'm gonna put money on that, was Richard Dwyer, online boxing analyst. Like, he had no hesitation in picking Zhilei, especially given the lopsided pro Joyce odds. But the reason that the odds going into the first one were so lopsided was because Joyce, aka the Juggernaut, was just rolling through the competition, stopping Carlos Takam in the middle rounds, stopping Daniel Dubois just before that in the 10th round with those jabs, battering Daniel Dubois' eye, and most impressively, being the first and only person to stop Joseph Parker. This was in September of 22. He knocked Joseph Parker out in the 11th round after battering him throughout the fight, where it just looked like it was one of those fights that make you kind of think that maybe there should be like a split in the heavyweight division in terms of guys who weigh, I don't know, like 230 or 235 and under, and then those behemoths who are like 240, 250 plus. By the way, Joyce going into that fight against Zhilei was like at 257. That's how much he weighed. Zhilei's closer to 280 than he is to 270. So a lot of those physical attributes that Joyce usually carried, size being one of them, that wasn't an advantage that he had going into that Zhang fight. So I guess it was understandable just seeing what we had seen from the Juggernaut, who had this iron chin and this relentless ability to just keep on coming forward, regardless of whether he was taking incoming fire or not. Like, you could see in that fight against Carlos Takam throws that overhand, sneaky right hand. He was catching Joyce with that punch. Joyce just didn't seem to care much. Same thing with the fight against Joseph Parker. Parker had some success, and he was sticking and moving, boxing as well as he could, lining up Joyce with that right hand. Again, Joyce just didn't seem to mind much about getting hit. And Joyce's way of punching, he would kind of plod forward, sticking that jab out, throwing that right hand to the body. And then even when you are moving laterally, Joyce will kind of punch in the area that you are headed towards, and it looks like a slow lumbering punch, but the problem is he's always throwing something. Like, he's stepping to you, and even again, if you're hitting him flush, he's still kind of clubbing you with punch after punch. It just gets to be a bit much in a 36-minute, 12 3-minute round fight. Well, you couple that with, the way that Zhilei faded in the middle and late rounds against Jerry Forrest after knocking Forrest down like 3 times in the first 3 rounds. That fight ended up being a majority draw. So Jerry Forrest had to win like almost every round after getting dropped 3 times in 3 rounds. Now, this ended up being more of a kidney-related medical issue that hospitalized Zhilei after that fight. But a lot of people still wondered, okay, how's he going to look in the late rounds against somebody who just increasingly comes on stronger and stronger as the fight progresses in Joyce. And we saw that fight where, Zhilei dropped Philip Ergovich in the early rounds, and he boxed well and fought very well in the middle and late rounds, but he did kind of fade a bit in the late rounds, and Philip Ergovich was able to earn a controversial, this was a very competitive and close fight. I thought maybe Zhilei edged the win, but they gave Philip Ergovich a unanimous decision win. So the idea was that even if Zhang Zhilei has some early round success against Joe Joyce, it's only a matter of time before that snowball of activity, that avalanche, starts to overwhelm Zhilei Zhang in the second half of the fight. But we got what we got, and that was Zhang Zhilei. I know I keep on switching up on the pronunciation or even the ordering of the first and last name. It's just, remember Yao Ming, but you would see Yao on the back of his jersey, so it's technically Ming Yao, at least if you're looking at the Chinese characters or their direct translation. So bear with me. Sometimes I'm going to say Zhang Zhilei, sometimes I'm going to say Zhilei Zhang. But in their first fight, Zhang not only connected with that left hand, he is a southpaw, not only connected with Joe Joyce, but he hurt and staggered Joe Joyce in the second round. He hurt Joe Joyce again in the third round. So it's one thing to make contact. It's one thing to land flush. It's another thing to land flush and to back Joe Joyce up and to visibly, observably hurt Joe Joyce. That's something that we're not used to seeing with Joe Joyce. So that automatically created a different element and wrinkle in that first fight. So it's like, damn, what's Joe Joyce gonna do? I'm assuming he's gonna just keep on marching forward until he eventually breaks Zhang, but that just didn't happen. Even when he was, he won a couple of those rounds when Zhang Zhilei would start to get hit and start to throw a little bit less, and you would see Joe Joyce kind of popping out that jab, hitting Zhang with it and hitting him with the right hand. So it's not like he was not having any success, or it's not like some of those Joe Joyce keep on plodding forward types of attributes didn't look like they were possibly working going into like the fourth and fifth round against Zhang. Although I would argue that Zhang was kind of picking a lot of those shots off. So not everything Joe Joyce was landing was really landing flush. Whereas when you look at what Zhang was landing, it was those snap your head back types of left hands, and he could throw a straight left hand, and then he throws like a little bit of it's got like a short loop on it, and it also lands very accurately. Zhang Zhilei is a very accurate puncher, and the big issue was because he was landing so accurately with that left hand, Joe Joyce's eye just started to swell up, and they had to call the fight, or they decided to call the fight in the sixth round. So it's not even like this was a late stoppage. This was in the sixth round. That eye swelled up by the second and third round. It was pretty much since Joe Joyce got hurt in the second round, the eye started to swell, and then it just got worse and worse quickly, where by the fifth round, the doctor was already taking a close look at it. So all it took was a couple more boom, 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 flush landing 3 to 4 punch combinations from Zhang to land flush on Joe Joyce for them to take another look at that eye and then eventually call the fight again in the sixth round. So heading into this rematch, which is actually close to even odds, Zhang Zhilei is a slight, like -110, very slight favorite against Joe Joyce in this rematch. But the way that I'm sizing this one up, I'm thinking a couple of things. One, Zhang Zhilei, it's like no contest. When you look at the way that these guys throw punches and the way that they strike, Zhang Zhilei is arguably the harder hitter. He's the bigger guy. Again, not to say that bigger guy equates to harder hitting, but if you look at the impact per punch that left hand has on his opponents, given the per punch impact that Joyce hits hard. And again, he stopped Joseph Parker. I'm just talking about per one punch. Zhang Zhilei is the more gifted puncher. And I know Joe Joyce is a Olympic silver medalist, but so is Zhang Zhilei. But Joe Joyce doesn't move his head. Zhang Zhilei also is the faster puncher. Like, you look at the plodding way that Joe Joyce throws his punches. Again, they land, and they land pretty effectively, and they keep on coming. But whenever you would see Zhang Zhilei, even when he would have his like pauses or his moments of inactivity and kind of put his hands up and absorb some of Joe Joyce's incoming fire, when Zhang would then explode, he would throw faster punches than Joe Joyce when he's breaking off those 2 to 3 punches at a time. Again, it's either like a looping lead right hook followed by that straight left, or he's leading with the straight left and throwing a hook behind it, or he's throwing 3 to 4 punches. But again, they're a lot faster than Joe Joyce's punches. So again, he will sometimes bide his time, wait about 20 to 30 seconds, and then explode with a couple combinations that again land flush and do damage, actual damage to Joe Joyce. So again, Zhilei to me is the more gifted puncher. Both of these guys are about 6'6", so height wise they're close. They both have about 80-inch reaches. So again, these are things that Joe Joyce is used to having a clear advantage of. Not the case again versus Zhilei. So same height, about the same reach. Zhilei has a hand speed advantage, has an accuracy plus per punch impact advantage. And I think Zhilei moves his head and is a little bit more crafty. He's more technical than Joe Joyce. Joe Joyce is a latecomer to the sport who had a lot of tutelage from different trainers. I mean, at one point, Abel Sanchez, Triple G's longtime former trainer, was training Joe Joyce. He's had a few different trainers, so he's got a lot of different instruction. He's been a kind of a student of the game and has been kind of on an accelerated learning curve in his adaptation or his evolution in the sport. But Zhilei, again, he's a lot more technical, crafty. So, I mean, what's going to change in this rematch? Well, here's one thing. All it takes is a little bit of head movement from Joe Joyce, and just don't keep your head right in the center, right there to be lined up for that left hand. Move your head a little bit, and I wonder if Joe Joyce's eye didn't puff up. I mean, this is a big if, because, to his credit, it was Zhilei landing those shots that caused the eye to puff up. So it's not like it was a headbutt. It's not like it was a fluke injury or anything like that. No, it was clear left hands that, everybody knew that if Zhang was going to have success, that the left hand was going to be a key ingredient. But if Joe Joyce's eye didn't puff up, what would have happened in the second half of the fight? We didn't really see Zhang have to battle through that late round fatigue that we were anticipating in this fight. So what if Zhilei still lands some effective shots, still wins a couple of the early rounds, but Joe Joyce's eye, for whatever reason, doesn't puff up in this rematch? I mean, what do you think the impact was going to be if the fight wasn't stopped in the 6th round? Was Joe Joyce on his way to turning it around, or was he going to get stopped by some other means other than his eye puffing up? Was he going to get dropped? Was he going to be beaten and defenseless on the ropes to where the ref has to kind of jump in and save Joe Joyce? Was that about to take place, or was Joe Joyce's constant, enduring activity eventually going to wear Zhilei down? We don't know these things. We won't know these things. But as it pertains to this rematch, I'm just going to operate under the assumption that, again, for whatever reason, the eye is not going to puff up in the same way. Even if he takes punches, I'm going to guess that it doesn't puff up the same way. I think this one's going to go some more rounds. I think that we are going to see Zhilei have to fight through that mid to late round fatigue. But I do think that his punches will still have a big impact. I still think that he's going to be landing clean shots against Joe Joyce and will do a lot of damage, not necessarily facially, but just in terms of backing Joe Joyce up and landing flush enough to where he could win some of the early rounds. But I think that it's going to be more grueling in that by the middle and late rounds, we are going to see Zhilei get tested like he was tested in the late rounds against Filip Ergovich. I think he's still going to land some clean punches. I think he's going to tie up when he needs to. He's going to use his experience. But I do think that we're going to see Joe Joyce cooking a little bit more. And I think that he's going to win some of those middle rounds. I think that we're going to actually get a fight here that goes to the judges' scorecards. I'm picking this one to go the 12-round distance. However, I think that Zhilei is still going to do enough, whether this involves a knockdown or just some of those shots that, get a lot of oohs and ahs from the crowd. I think that Zhilei will still be landing those types of punches. Again, I expect Joe Joyce to have some mid and late round success. I think this is going to go the distance, but I think that Zhilei is going to have done enough to edge a decision against Joe Joyce. So I think that he's going to win back-to-back against Joe Joyce here. I wouldn't be totally surprised if Joe Joyce wins a decision. I would be a little bit surprised if Zhilei finishes Joe Joyce twice, because that would mean that Joe Joyce, even having fought Zhang the first time, didn't make any adjustments. And I do think that Joe Joyce is enough of a thinking fighter to where he knows he's got to move his head a little bit more. Look, I'm not expecting him to turn into like somebody who's just changing levels and who's becoming like a Shakur Stevenson style fighter. I'm not expecting that from Joe Joyce. I do expect him to do something to account for that left hand. I don't think he's just going to be a sitting duck in the way that he was in the first fight. But I think that Zhilei is going to do enough to win the decision. Let me know your thoughts here. This one has huge implications. This is, whoever wins this will still be the WBO mandatory for the heavyweight title. But we're kind of in this holding pattern of sorts because Tyson Fury's about to fight Francis Ngannou, and there's really no telling what he's going to do with that WBC belt after the fight with Ngannou. Is he going to come back and finally fight either, Alexander Usyk in a battle for undisputed? Because it looks like what they're doing is lining up Alexander Usyk versus Filip Ergovic, who is the, I believe, IBF mandatory for Usyk. So, I'm still hoping that we get a battle for undisputed between Tyson Fury and Alexander Usyk, but because of Fury's Francis Ngannou fight schedule, because of this IBF mandatory, between Usyk and Filip Ergovic, and then we've got the WBO mandatory who's going to emerge between Zhilei and Joe Joyce. Not to mention if Fury gets by Francis Ngannou, or regardless, because the WBC belt is not up for grabs on this one, but the WBC said that they have no plans to rush a mandatory for that WBC title. But I'm assuming that if they do end up making Deontay Wilder against Anthony Joshua, that there will be a WBC mandatory to emerge from that fight. That's speculation right now. And we just saw that Usyk beat Daniel Dubois, which was his WBA. He was a lesser belt holder for the WBA. So that tied up the WBA obligations for Usyk. So there are a lot of moving pieces here. So there's no guarantee that whoever wins between Zhilei and Joe Joyce in this rematch, that they've got a clear shot for their next fight to be for one of the titles against Usyk. There's no guarantee of that because they basically have to wait in line, at least behind Filip Ergovic as it stands. But yeah, let me know what you think of Zhilei versus Joe Joyce 2, and what you think about the state of the heavyweight division as it stands right now. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments. By the way, I'm just putting this out there. I really wish we did get Deontay Wilder versus Andy Ruiz. And who knows, maybe we will, but it just seems like there's a lot of delusion in terms of what these fighters think that they're about to make in some of these non-super duper fights. Like, it seems like it's been difficult to even get Deontay Wilder versus Anthony Joshua together, and that's a super fight, right? Same thing with the battle for undisputed. It just seems like there's not enough money in the pot to satisfy the appetites of both fighters in a lot of these cases. So something's got to give here. But yeah, let me know your thoughts about these things in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.